Welcome to Standard Life House. Really delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, which is an interview with Anna Sarwar, who's the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. And the interview is going to be expertly chaired by Chris Derrin, the Director of Reform Scotland. But before we get started, I want to just say a few words of introduction about me and also Standard Life, which is part of the Phoenix Group. So my name's Gail Isat, and I'm the Managing Director of our workplace and retail intermediary business here at Standard Life. And Standard Life are part of the Phoenix Group, and we are one of the UK's largest savings and retirement businesses. And through Standard Life, we actually have a sizable base here in Scotland. So we've got a strong desire to see Scotland remain a good base to help businesses grow and thrive. And at Phoenix, we've got a really simple purpose, actually. We just help people save up for and enjoy retirement. But actually, that simple purpose, we're seeing some real headwinds at the moment. So we've got people who are living longer, but they're not always living longer lives filled with good mental, financial and physical health. We've got a looming savings crisis where people are just simply not saving enough for retirement. And those themes are true for the UK, but actually true for Scotland. So Scotland has a population that's ageing faster than the UK. And recently Phoenix did some research on over 40-year-olds in Scotland and what their attitudes were to retirement. And we had some quite shocking stats that we found out. So we found out that 14% of people were saving nothing. Probably another 15% of people will say they had about between £1,000 and £10,000 for retirement. And actually 23% just didn't know what they had saved. So I think that brings to life that the challenge is real in terms of how do we help people engage with the pension savings? How do we get them to envisage the retirement they want? And how do we help them make that reality? Now, auto-enrolment has been a fantastic help. So that's brought 10 million more savers into saving for the long term. But it's not the only thing that we can do. I think this idea of a cliff edge retirement in the future, it won't exist. People will want to and have to work for longer. Now at Phoenix, we're really active on in a number of policy areas, anything that helps people with that challenge of saving up for retirement. Now, clearly, auto-enrolment, that's more under sort of Westminster government, and we're working actively in Westminster to encourage saving rates to go up. But the Scottish Parliament can also help in terms of how do we help people have longer working lives. And that can be done through action on good work practices, skills and education. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Scottish Labour have got to say on that, but also, I am sure, a real breadth of other topics that we're going to cover tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Anna and Chris to the stage for what is going to be a really interesting discussion.
Whatsoever. That's all on you, by the way.
No, I'm going to blame the questioner. We were having a chat before we came on, Chris, about one of the last time you did an interview like this, you had Tony Blair on who slagged off the clothes you were wearing as part of the interview, and you made comment that you were surprised I was wearing a tie today. But I was at the anti-Reform Summit this morning and out at the Reform Summit this evening, so that's why wearing the tie. I think you might need a rebrand.
I have to say, Tony spent quite a bit of time critiquing my cardigan that I wore when I was interviewing him, but he did take his tie off. I'll just make that point.
He wasn't trying to be First Minister, but I suppose you're disappointed by that fact, Chris, I would imagine. The arch Blairite that you are, Chris.
Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see such a brilliant turnout. My name's Chris Derrin. I'm not Derrin. And I'm Director of Reform Scotland. We are changing our name. You might be relieved to hear, including you, to do that, so bear with us over the next month and we will emerge like a butterfly from a chrysalis. Can I just thank the teams at Phoenix and Charlotte Street Partners for their help tonight in making all of this happen, and thanks to you too for coming along to what is the second in our series of conversations with Scotland's senior political leaders. Previously we spoke to Russell Finlay of the Scottish Conservatives, and in August we'll have John Swinney. But tonight, it's the turn of Anas Sarwar, the leader of Scottish Labour, who is one of only two realistic options to be Scotland's next First Minister, and we're grateful to you.
I'm going to put that on the leaflet, Chris. Thank you.
One of only two options. You may want to aim higher. Now, I have to say, if we were holding this event at this time last year, and in the conversations we've been having over the period, then the context in which it was being held would be somewhat different, because at that point, Scottish Labour were ahead in the polls, and Anas looked a safe bet to become First Minister at next year's Holyrood election. You could feel it in the air, you could smell it. The public were ready for change in Edinburgh after nearly 2 decades of SNP rule, in London after 14 years of Conservative rule. Chaos and underperformance had been the story on both sides of the border. And I certainly thought at that point that the momentum behind Anas was unstoppable, and I probably wrote that in the New Statesman repeatedly, which is why I'm not known as one of the great fortune tellers in Scottish.
Oh, you are one of the great fortune tellers, don't worry.
I believed, as did others, that the arrival of Keir Starmer in Downing Street would give Anas and his party a further dunce down the path to power. And Anas and his team were talking the language of reform, of a new era, of courageous decisions that perhaps arguably had been avoided by government for too long. Add to that his natural charm, his undeniable charisma, and his cute little smile. Smile, Anas, smile.
I feel a bit awkward now, actually, to be honest. I thought I was coming to a serious conversation.
Let's see where the evening goes.
You coming to the dinner afterwards, aren't you? I'm a bit worried.
Well, the deal at least seemed, if not done, then close to completion. But obviously since then, and everyone in this room will be aware that things have changed. Keir Starmer's government has had a difficult start to life, partly due to the conditions it's been forced to operate within, and partly due to what we might call some unforced errors. There's now not all that much between Labour and the Conservatives and reform in the opinion polls, the UK opinion polls, and that failure to really hit the ground running has set Scottish Labour and Anas back from where they were a year ago. Now, Anas and Keir had a deal, and the deal was that you would help deliver a Labour government at Westminster, and you delivered on that in spades, as to be said. The quid pro quo was that Keir would help deliver a Scottish Labour administration at Holyrood. Now, it's not for Anas to say that while he kept his part of the deal, Keir hasn't, but I can say it. And I think we can look at the situation that the Scottish Labour Party are in today and say that a large part of that isn't down to anything you've done or not done, but down to some of the issues that the Labour government at Westminster has had. The SNP, meanwhile, has stabilised what seemed to be a sinking ship. John Swinney and Kate Forbes have moved the government sharply away from the woke agenda and the interventionist social policies of Nicola Sturgeon, and rhetorically at least are focusing on public service reform and economic growth. They've made some smart political manoeuvres, and Reform UK, the political party, not the think tank, has soared up the polls, taking disillusioned voters away mainly from the Conservatives, but also Labour. So, on top of that, we've had global economic and political conditions that have made Labour's goal of restoring healthy economic growth much harder. And there's not a lot of cheer or optimism to be found out there on the streets. Repeatedly, opinion polls, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I'm just saying it like it is, opinion polls now show Scottish Labour are trailing the SNP by some distance ahead of the Holyrood election. I guess John Swinney would now be the bookies' favourite to retain Bute House, which will mean at the end of it all, I think something like 23 unbroken years of SNP rule, which is kind of staggering if you think about it in any competitive democracy. So, as I say, the context for tonight's conversation is very different than I would have expected it to be a year ago. But you can't keep a good man down, and I know that Anas still believes his party can win next year. I'm almost tempted to do a straw poll of the room. What do you think?
You can do whatever you like. I'm perfectly relaxed about it.
Who thinks Anas, after May next year, will be First Minister? Who thinks John Swinney will be First Minister? Does anyone have any other views? Nigel Farage? Anyway, so it just shows that there's all to play for, but you're not in the position that we might have expected things to be a year ago. But I know that you still believe your party can win, and tonight you're here to tell us why and how. And perhaps that's a bit of a gloomy introduction. Quite a long introduction.
I think the great thing about that introduction, Chris, is you have confirmed what I knew 4 years ago and have believed ever since I took on this job, that I've got the hardest job in British politics. But people have written us off many, many times before, and no doubt people are writing us off again now. But I genuinely have every optimism and belief that we will win next year and form a government. And the reason why I say that is you've got to look at everything in the context and where we're trying to get to. So the context of where we were 4 years ago, we were 32 points behind the SNP. If you look at where we were this far out from the last general election, we were 12 points behind the SNP. Despite you saying that this far out from a general election, we were actually still behind the SNP in many of the opinion polls by 2 or 3 points. We weren't ahead of the SNP even 2 months before a general election. And very few people believed that Scottish Labour could win the majority of seats in Scotland, let alone win 37 seats to 9 seats for the SNP. Now, where you're absolutely right is, as a former dentist, I can say this, there's been some teething problems in the early days of a Labour government. I wholeheartedly accept that. But I never believed it was going to be easy post a general election. And I still, to this day, believe what I believed before the general election, actually, that there was no pathway to a Scottish Labour victory in 2026 unless we removed the Tories from office across the UK and elected a UK Labour government. Because if the Tories had won again, then there's no chance that Scottish Labour could compete next year, and politics would have been shifted right back on its head again. And I think the argument and debate around independence would have spiked again, and indeed it would have gone back to that two sides of the same coin of divisive politics between the Tories playing themselves as the strong unionist party and the SNP playing themselves as the strong nationalist party, and no one actually focusing on what's the issues that are driving people in terms of their everyday challenges in their lives here in Scotland. And the challenge we've got is, so I wholeheartedly, I'm not going to deny reality, is there a challenge we now face? Absolutely. But if you look at what's happened in the polls, I actually think there's an over-explanation that people give around what's happened with the SNP. The SNP, despite the fact that Labour's had difficulties across the UK, and that has also been felt in Scotland, despite the fact that in the opinion polls Scottish Labour's vote's gone down, the SNP's vote has only risen marginally, if at all, in many polls. They got 32% in the general election, they're getting 32% in opinion polls now. And where Labour's vote has gone in terms of those that voted Labour last year but aren't saying they're definitely going to vote Labour next year, they actually haven't gone to the SNP in large spades. The vast majority of those people have gone into the undecided column. Then another chunk has gone into the Reform column. Then the third chunk has gone, if you combine the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and then there's about 2 or 3% that have gone to the SNP. And if anything in the last year, people's views on the negatives of an SNP government have hardened rather than people thinking they're a competent government again. So I accept that John Swinney might look like he is externally steadied the ship. He actually hasn't changed people's views about whether they think a Scottish government is delivering for them. And the challenge that we've got in the next year is, I don't think we need to persuade people that the Scottish government is failing them. I think they believe that already, to be honest with you. What we have to persuade them on is that we can do something different. And so that's going to be one fundamental test, is about whether we can persuade people the SNP have failed them. I think they believe that. Whether we can deliver something different, and I hope we get into the details of that, because it's really important about what our platform is going to be going into that election. And then the third part is where the UK Labour Party fits in. And ultimately, Scotland's going to face a choice next year. That election, the SNP is going to want to make it a referendum on the rights and wrongs of a UK Labour government, whereas we've got to make it about the rights and wrongs of what a Scottish government does. Because if we want to change our National Health Service, if we want to change what's happening in our communities, if we want to change our education system, our skill system, our broader economy, our regional economies, what happens in our local government, what happens in our local services, that is going to be decided by who our Scottish government is. And I honestly think if the SNP want to play a campaign that somehow all the ills in Scotland are because of a party that's been in government for 2 years and not a government that's been in power for 20 years, I honestly don't think they're going to win that argument. And that's why I've got every confidence about the election next year.
But ultimately, the data, and all we can go on at the moment is the data that's available to us, suggests that, as you said, you have fallen back considerably in the polls. I mean, one poll said you'd end with 19 MSPs. For a party that's going to be challenging for the government.
That poll also said that 57% of Scots, including the undecided, support independence. I don't think anyone seriously believes that.
Nevertheless, you've fallen back. And for a party that seemed on a kind of guide path to taking power, to find yourself a year out, back on your haunches again, is a curious position to be in. Why do you think that's happened? Because the things you're saying tonight, you've been saying for ages, and we've done interviews with New Statesman and others, you've said these things, and they sounded quite convincing, and certainly when you had the momentum, they were very convincing. Something's happened, and what's going to close that gap between then and now? Why are people not buying your message at the moment? Why will they buy it in 6 months, 9 months' time?
So I think in all of these things, and I remember having this conversation about the polling going into the general election where Labour was considerably behind, and I still had confidence we'd win the election in Scotland and we would form a UK Labour government, and it's the reason why I've got confidence going into election next year, is actually how people think about electoral cycles is based upon, I think there's a moment where the public mood and the public attention shifts from one electoral cycle to the next. So I think coming out of the Scottish Parliament election, people were still stuck in the frame of Holyrood politics, and not until the final 2-3 months going into a general election did they switch to a Westminster frame about what the choice was. I think people right now are still stuck in a frame of the post-general election reaction to an early days of a Labour government, and they're not yet seriously thinking about the choices that face them coming election in 2026. And I think that's also dictating some of what's happening in the opinion polls. But I think the sooner we can get people, and I've got every confidence about this, the sooner we can get people to think about the choice in 2026, and we can frame the choice in 2026, then I do think we will compete, and I do think we'll win that election. Because for us, it's going to be about the National Health Service. It's going to be about making sure we respect the public's money and stop the waste and the incompetence. It's going to be around how we deliver skills for every young person to close the opportunity gap, not just have the endless debate about the attainment gap, how we support our local businesses and have regional economic development, not just thinking of Scotland as one big monolith, and also having a next generation of leadership. That debate is still to be had in Scotland, but that's the debate I'm looking forward to.
Well, speaking of looking ahead to next year, today you're in Glasgow at John Swinney's summit, his anti-reform summit, if I can put it that way, intended to lock reform out of Holyrood, because they're doing very well in the polls, and the suggestion is they'll get somewhere between 14 and 20 MSPs next year. And I was looking at photos that came out on social media, and it did remind me of sitting around a large table at the Scotland office recently with the great and good of Scotland, Civic Scotland, not sure why I was there, but the rest of the great and good of Civic Scotland. And there was a point where I looked around and I thought if Ian Murray could hit a button and drop us all into a Shark Tank, it would probably improve the condition of the nation quite dramatically.
Are you meaning that for the audience here today as well, Chris? Harsh.
Any of them here today. But looking at that, you know, the Scottish establishment sitting around a table, or sitting around a number of tables, basically saying to people out there in the country, you know, you might be thinking about voting for Scotland, and we regard you as somewhere beyond the pale, because that's how it will come across. And the statement that came out, I don't know if anyone's seen it afterwards, was the most platitudinous statement of progressive woke values that you could possibly imagine. It was a very, very hard thing to sort of read and not want to go and vomit immediately after reading it. And I'm just speaking frankly here. You were there. You were part of that conversation. I presume you signed the statement at the end of it. How do you think that meeting and that kind of statement comes across to the ordinary people? I speak to quite a lot. You know, just ordinary folk, a lot of Labour voters who are actually thinking about voting reform next May, and it's not. They're not. You young man, you over there, you're a racist. And I'm not really. I just think you're all crap. And that actually is a big part of what. Right? So to get together and tell people you're beyond the pale because you've got a view that the current situation isn't working, and you're ready to hit the big red button that people across the West have been hitting recently. Does it help, including those people who voted Labour last July, to tell them that they're far right, which is the message that's being sent out from that kind of meeting, and the rhetoric that's being sent out from that?
Well, I think, again, Chris, I think it's important to separate what John Swinney said the meeting was about and what John Swinney said weeks before the meeting and what actually happened. And Sarah, who sat next to me at that press conference, that rose between two thorns at the press conference between me and John Swinney at the press conference, is I'll just repeat what I said going into the summit and what I said during the summit, and Sarah was there, so she can vouch for it, is fundamentally, if today, and this is what it will appear like to many people, it looks like and sounds like there's a Scottish political establishment or a broader Scottish establishment coming together to talk to itself, then you are further alienating and pushing away the very people who feel so disenfranchised by politics and feel as if, and are pushed towards divisive politics. Secondly, a government that's been in power for 18 years can't now pretend they want to do a grand summit of 50 organisations, say, let's come up with ideas. If they had great ideas, they would have delivered them by now, to be blunt about it. And third is, I think we have to learn lessons from the other side of the Atlantic and other parts of the world where everyone fixated on individual politicians that were big personalities, divisive figures, or indeed individual political brands, and they didn't confront the root causes about why people feel disaffected. And the reality is, if you want to challenge disenfranchisement and you want to challenge divisive politics, governments have got to deliver for people. And we don't have a Scottish government that's delivering for people. At a time when 1 in 6 Scots are stuck on an NHS waiting list, I think the NHS was only mentioned once today, and that was by me. There was no other reference to the NHS today at the summit, which again in itself I think shows you a broad gap between Civic Scotland talking to itself and what's a lived experience for people outside of it. So we've got to talk about the issues that matter to people, that they don't think government works for them, they don't think the economy works for them, they don't think their public services work for them, they don't think any politician's competent at spending their money, they think we fixate on minority issues that don't look like it's the priorities and the impact of their everyday lives, and that's what we've got to confront, and that's what I'm going to confront and what I want us to confront if we're successful next year, because that's ultimately how we change people's lives. But to change people's lives, we've got to win the election next year. And so I was open about that. And in reference to the actual words, again, in the actual summit itself, I was really clear the words were all well-meaning, not going to change a single person's life. Nice words to put on a piece of paper, but they don't offer a single solution. And it just, again, emphasises a distance between a political establishment and the public. And we are going to get into communities. We are going to confront the big challenges. We're going to confront the housing emergency. We're going to make sure our local economy works for people. We're going to make sure that we can make work pay. We're going to make our public services work for people. We're going to make sure we reform our education, our skills system. We're going to make sure we reform our NHS to get it fit for the future. All of that is what we're going to campaign on. All of that is what we're going to deliver. And all of that I'm happy to go into in much, much more detail with you tonight and beyond.
Despite all of that, you went. Why did you go?
So I think when you've got, so you think about huge challenges that exist globally right now, and when you've got the leaders of every single faith organisation, and to put that in stark terms, when you've got a war happening in the Middle East, and you've got the leader of the Islamic faith and the leader of the Jewish faith sitting side by side saying we are willing to put aside strong views we hold about a war that's happening the other side of the world to demonstrate how we can foster better connections, human connections and better outcomes for people and communities here. And when they ask you that you should be at a summit to have those conversations and to confront and tell home truths in the room, I think that's very hard to say no to. And so the reality is you had people that were leading figures in business that were there, and at the same time you had Ros Foyer, who is the General Secretary of the STUC in the room. Again, there'd be lots of things they disagree on. You had people of all faiths and none in the room. You had charities who were challenging government, but also many who would probably advocate for government in the room. So I think many people went there in good faith, but it's got to be outcomes driven. And my big issue with this current Scottish Government is we love a talking shop, we love a strategy document, we love a working group, we love pulling people around the table to find consensus, but then we do sweet F all coming out of it. And the reason why I use that harsh language is I actually don't think, and it touches upon the point you made, Chris, about what people hear. And I think the big challenge we've got is for lots of communities, when they hear politicians talk about the politics of the far right, or they hear them talk about divisive politics, or they hear them talk about kumbaya language, I think for a lot of people in our communities, it sounds like our political leaders and our Scottish Government is saying, you're too stupid to understand, you're too racist to understand, we've got this, we're the clever ones, we'll come up with the solutions. And that only further disenfranchises and only further entrenches. And so People are not going to parties like Reform or politicians like Nigel Farage because they agree with their values, they agree with their politics, or they think that those people are like them. Nigel Farage is so different from so many communities across the UK, so many communities here in Scotland. I think people are going there right now because they are selecting the most destructive option, the FU button, because they're so scunnered with how they think institutions don't work for them or politicians don't work for them. And if politicians don't grapple that and confront that underlying issue and cause, our world will continue to get more and more insecure, more and more unsafe. And the very people that we get into rooms and we talk about well-intentioned ways we talk about are the ones we're going to fail the most. And that, for me, I think is the big challenge for our generation of politics. And that's what I want to confront.
So sitting around that table today where you were subordinate to John Swinney, who was chairing it.
But I think that's unfair to say, because that's are we saying that the Chief Rabbi was subordinate to John Swinney? No. Or are we saying the Church of Scotland minister was subordinate?
And you want to be First Minister, and he's currently First Minister. He called the meeting, you went along. Let's just ask the question, is there any conditions under which you would become, if you lose the next election, come second and form a coalition with the SNP and become Deputy First Minister?
No.
None
No.
whatsoever.
I'm standing to be First Minister. I want to be First Minister. I want to be elected as First Minister. I want to change the country. And the SNP's failed this country. That's why we need a change.
And so if the outcome wasn't what you wanted, you wouldn't go into coalition with the SNP?
I didn't get into politics for outcomes I don't want.
So you wouldn't go into
I wanted a Labour government. We delivered it. I want a Scottish Labour government. We're going to deliver it, but we've got to earn people's trust and support, and no coalition with the SNP. They have failed. They've had their chance for 18 years. By the time we get to the election next year, it'll be almost 20 years. They've had a chance. And I think lots of people will looked at a Labour Party that was in power for a good chunk of time and thought they had their chance. Let's give somebody else a shot. They've had 20 years. If you think about the NHS, the SNP's been in charge of our NHS for more than a quarter of the NHS's entire existence. And I think they've demonstrated that they aren't fit to reform it and make it fit for the future. That's why we need a change next year. One of many reasons we need a change next year, and that's why we need a change of government. And so we're going to form our own government if we are successful. But as I say, that's up to the good people of Scotland. We've got to earn their trust, earn their support, re-earn their trust, re-earn their support, like we've had to do many times over the last 4 years. But I'm absolutely determined to do it.
And you've been rolling out your policies over the last year, especially maybe since the turn of the year as well. What's been interesting, I suppose, is that with John Swinney moving the SNP away from the Sturgeon agenda, that the territory of public sector reform and economic growth, which you kind of had to yourself as the only alternative First Minister for a while, it's now got a bit more crowded because the SNP are at least talking about those kind of things, about cutting waiting lists and about changing the performance of our schools and economic growth. Are you worried at all that your message becomes a bit diluted by the time it reaches the public? You're both saying you're going to get waiting lists down, you're both going to improve schools, you're both going to bring back economic growth, you both have what you claim are the answers. They're not hugely dissimilar in some areas, or certainly not to a populace that doesn't pay much attention to politics because they're smart and they've got better things to do. But when they do pay attention, they're just going to see two parties offering varieties of the same things. How do you establish differentiation now that you've got an SNP government that's kind of trying to occupy the same social democratic...
But they could try and, Chris, they could occupy any space they want to in their own heads. Their record is still going to be in front of the people of Scotland that they're going to be judged on. So, of course, they're going to go into election saying they're going to cut waiting lists, but right now 1 in 6 Scots are on an NHS waiting list, and waiting lists continue to go up in Scotland when they're being cut in other parts of the country. Of course, they're going to now say they believe in economic growth. They had a coalition partner who had debates in Parliament about whether growth was even a good thing. So they can say what they want to say. Of course, that's what they're going to try and do. What I'm going to try and demonstrate is that we are going to do things differently, and we're going to offer a different generation of leadership. And what I mean specifically, so let's take some of the specifics. Take our National Health Service. If we are going to reform and renew our National Health Service, then we have to accept that the structure as it currently exists is not fit for purpose. We are a population of 5.5 million people. We do not need 50 boards. And I think that's one of the key challenges around this government is they are bureaucracy heavy. because they love to create layers of management, layers of bureaucracy that allows them to pass the buck and pass the blame. I want to instead take responsibility. Ministers will be in charge. Ministers will take responsibility. If something goes wrong, ministers will be held account, and we'll re-democratise our National Health Service in a way that I think it's been moved away from democratising our National Health Service. We don't need 14 territorial boards, all these specialist boards, 30 integrated joint boards. We don't need all these chief executives, finance directors, all these multiple layers of people that cost a lot of money, when in actual fact that money can instead be used on consultants, nurses, treatments, theatres. So we're going to reform our NHS in terms of the structures in the system. We're going to bring it into modern times. Many of our health boards still use fax machines. There'll be lots of people out there right now who don't even know what a fax machine is. Our National Health Service still uses fax machines. We still don't have a proper functioning NHS app. You still can't do online bookings in a similar way you can in other parts of the country, partly because we want to try and create and build our own system rather than replicating systems that exist elsewhere, because we have to do it our way with a certain title.
Single functioning IT system for the entire Scottish NHS?
Absolutely, that's what we should aspire to. Is that
something you deliver?
Yes, absolutely, but it's going to take time. I'm not one of those people that's going to pretend that day one of a Scottish Labour government everything's going to be resolved and we're going to be, souped up and ready to go. It's going to take time. The number one priority will be in the first 2 years is to declare that waiting times emergency, to clear the backlogs. We shouldn't have a system right now where health boards are hoarding in cash and not allowing their patients or indeed their clinicians to go to other parts of the country in order to either get treatment or to perform treatment. So, for example, a waiting time in Greater Glasgow and Clyde could be 54 weeks, it could be 16 weeks in Tayside, but a patient from Greater Glasgow and Clyde can't go get that treatment in Tayside because the health board wants to hold on to the money. That's an archaic way of doing our healthcare. We've not got proper workforce planning in the NHS. How do we partner our colleges, our universities, our modern apprenticeships with the workforce challenges we have in our National Health Service? That in itself is going to be really, really important. And then the digital innovation and technology piece is in itself going to be a huge, huge opportunity for us. I know one company, for example, that's based in Scotland that is using its technology to increase theatre capacity and theatre output in NHS trusts in England, but they can't win a contract in Scotland. So they are helping in some theatres, taking capacity from 64% to 74% in terms of capacity of theatres. We're not using that technology in Scotland. If we increased our existing theatre capacity by 10%, that's the equivalent of building 5 or 6 new hospitals. Think about all the capital investment that has to go into building 5 or 6 new hospitals. If we could do that by doing better workforce planning, using technology, more innovative treatments, and breaking down the structural barriers in our NHS, that would bring us into the 21st century, 25 years too late, but still bring us into the 21st century and make us fit for the future. That's the kind of different approach I want us to take. I could say similar around our education system.
Well, hang on, before we move on to that, could we talk about social care, which
please,
is
absolutely
the elephant in the room when it comes to health. And social care matters in terms of keeping people healthy so there's not more pressure on the NHS because they're better looked after. Before they get ill, they're kind of caught, if they do get ill, they're treated before they reach a crisis point of going to the NHS. And then at the other end, when they're ready to leave leave hospitals, they can go into social care, which frees up beds and frees up waiting lists and times to do it. It's a hugely expensive thing to do, and I haven't yet heard any kind of response from a senior Scottish politician that really gets a method for delivering that, with the SNP's idea of a centralised National Care Service. That's kind of fallen by the wayside. The complaints that it needs to be much more localised than that. We've got people working in the care service who are grotesquely underpaid compared to their equivalents in the NHS. And no one's really grabbing it because it's such a difficult, classically Scottish, it's such a difficult thing to do that we're just avoiding it and storing up trouble for the future. But how do you solve the care crisis?
So the challenge, so the National Care Service has been the Scottish Labour policy for 12 years. It was actually first argued for by Jackie Bailey. She never fails to remind me that was her idea in the first place. But our challenge, again, this goes back, I think, to the implementation gap we have in Scotland, is no good idea survives this government. It was a great idea, but again, tens of millions of pounds were spent trying to create a system rather than actually improve outcomes. So it didn't fund a single extra care package, didn't fund an extra other member of staff or improve the pay of a single care worker across the country. So if you think about the challenge in our health and social care system right now, we have got a problem at the entrance door of acute care, and we've got a problem at the exit door. Our problem at the entrance door is because general practice is so diminished from what it was before, and the demands on general practice have gone up so much, more and more people are then having to present at, for example, A&Es, and that's clogging up the entrance door. The other way of thinking about it is, it used to be about 10, 12 years ago that 11% of the NHS budget went to primary care. It's now 6%. And I can understand why the last Labour government, when I was in Scotland, wanted to think about specialisation and a real focus on specialisation in acute care. And I think that was the right solution for that time, but times have moved on. I actually think now, with people living longer lives, people with comorbidities, with more complex care needs, the need for generalists is now even more important than just the specialists, and that's why general medicine has got more important and wraparound community care has got more important. So how do we beef up primary care? That's partly, in actual fact, it's cheaper. So the money, that's why part of my frustration is I actually think the money exists. And I know that might sound like a kind of glib thing to say. The level of waste, bureaucracy and misspent funding in public institutions across the board would not be accepted in any private sector organisation that's in this building right now. Would not be accepted, but we accept it as if it's completely normal. And there's countless examples of that. So actually, it's cheaper. So keeping someone, so that's the entrance door. We've got to. That's partly about beefing up the number of GPs. Yes.
It's cheaper. It does feel a bit trite saying that. I know.
No, let me. I'll give you an example of it.
But where does the money? Because you will have to take money.
I'm going to give you an example of it. So let me just finish the point with primary care, because the big funding gap is around social care, which is the heart of what you said. And I'm not diminishing that. I'm just making the point about the entrance door. Is if we can get the number of GPs up, if we can get more allied health professionals into primary care and a proper wraparound care that does bring in voluntary sector as well as the public sector, I think we can beef up primary care, which stops people needing to go to the entrance door. And then you've got the massive challenge at the exit door, where delayed discharge is through the roof. And to put that into context, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, which is the largest hospital in the country, 450 beds, to put into context the level of delayed discharge we have in any given time in Scotland, we have the level of delayed discharge, which is the equivalent of every single bed in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, every single night for 18 months is the level of delayed discharge challenge. And keeping someone in hospital is exponentially more expensive than funding either a transition bed in a care home or indeed funding a care package for someone to be at home, or indeed a care package within a local authority, or indeed from the voluntary sector or the private sector. And if we can use the existing capacity that exists, if you go out and speak to social care providers, they've got loads of capacity, it's unused capacity. So if we use that capacity, that frees up the beds in the hospital, it puts someone in a unit that is less expensive than keeping them in the hospital. It also frees up other capacity for other parts of the NHS, and it allows us to confront the social care challenge. And then we've got to have a housing system that matches it as well, because right now, we've declared a housing emergency in the country, where how are we incentivising people to do the adaptations in their homes? How are we incentivising people when they're building new homes, whether it's developers, either in the social rented sector, housing associations, or indeed the private sector? How are we incentivising them to have the relevant adaptations that are required in individual homes, given the fact that we've got a rising and ageing demographic that's going to need more and more adaptations in home to make it fit for around care at home? All of that needs to fit into our housing system at the exact same time, and that requires joint up thinking, not having government thinking in silos in different departments, and recognising there's got to be a longer term supply chain of work and strategic pipeline planning for reforming our public services, but also reforming our housing system. That will take time, but the money exists, the investment opportunity exists as well, from private sector as well as public sector pension funds, for example, which I don't think we use anywhere near as effective as we could do. Most of the money goes actually outside of Scotland when it could be spent within Scotland if we make them investable propositions where returns are guaranteed by government. All of this, if it's joint up, I think can give us a pipeline of a different outcome in Scotland in 10 years' time, but it requires hard choices, honesty, and long-term decisions.
We could obviously talk about the NHS for the rest of our time, but I think there are other things to touch upon, and one of those is gender reform. So you whipped your party to support the gender reform bill, which was then blocked by the Conservative UK government. There were more than a few MSPs in your party, as you know, that were quite unhappy at being whipped to vote to support the bill. And given everything that's happened since, you could argue that that decision calls your judgment into question. Your tweets last week after the Supreme Court ruling, and again, I mean this without any prejudice, looked a wee bit, you know, I've always supported women's only spaces and the rest of it, and you saw the response from the women campaigners and other campaigners. Looked a bit ill-judged. Why don't you just hold your hands up and admit you got that wrong? Imagine that your party had stood against that bill and said, we can see that this isn't going down the right path. We can see the impact this is going to have on women's rights. And actually, we can't bring ourselves to support it. I know you put forward some amendments, but actually in the end, you backed the bill that the Tory government had to stop happening. I don't think you've yet apologised to the women who have been through such a hell of a lot over the last couple of years, or held your hand up and just admitted you got that decision wrong. It felt a bit to me like you followed fashionable opinion rather than took a tough decision that a leader might take on the basis of facts that are in front of them.
Look, I would argue there's difficult decisions that have had to be made throughout the process, and all of that has come with political challenge and, of course, personal challenge in all of it.
Well, you're wrong about the bill. Did you make the wrong decision to back the bill?
But again, Chris, you're asking me a question that I've answered multiple times before, which is to say that I do think we made mistakes in the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. I've said that multiple times publicly.
Should you have backed the bill as a party?
So, as I've said, at the time, and I've said multiple times since, that I think we should have been much, much more robust on support for our amendments as a condition for support of the bill. And when our amendments were not supported, then I think we ultimately should have made a different judgment call. I've said that on multiple occasions over the course of the last year or so. But also I think there's a real challenge here, which is look, I totally understand there are really, really strongly held views and rightly strongly held views, but I think we've got to be really, really clear about what was argued for at the time and what has been argued for since. The Scottish Labour Party has always, even during the GRR bill process, supported the primacy of the Equality Act, and we wanted that in the face of the bill. The Scottish Government refused to put it in the face of the bill, but they did say it would be in the guidance. The guidance never came. We resolutely supporting single-sex spaces based on biological sex, and that was services, spaces, which we were really clear about. Again, we wanted that to be on the face of the bill. The government did not put it on the face of the bill, but said it would be in the guidance. The guidance never came. So we've always been resolute about our support for single-sex spaces based on biological sex. And we also made a differentiation between how do you remove the indignities and inhumanities of the process of obtaining a GRC from those hard-fought rights that women have fought for, and we still got a long way to go in terms of delivering, in terms of gender equality in our country. And we made those arguments at the time. And I continue to stand by that. I want us to support the Primacy of the Equality Act. I actually really welcome the Supreme Court judgment, which makes clear the primacy of the Equality Act, which makes clear the support of protection of single-sex spaces based on biological sex. And I think despite the fact that the GRR bill was never enacted, there was still government action, government guidance, and public body and public sector guidance that went beyond what was the determination and the intention of the Equality Act. And I think you're seeing that play out, for example, in the case in NHS Fife. I think you've seen other examples of it as well, which all happened despite the fact the GRR bill wasn't enacted. And I think there was a bit of, to be blunt, organisational capture from the Scottish Government and from some of the public sector bodies, which now has to be urgently responded to post the Supreme Court action. Look, I always said throughout the process that I wanted to see the indignities in the process of obtaining a GRC looked at and removed, but at the same time as protecting single-sex spaces based on biological sex. And I think the big unfortunate thing in all of this is, and again, self-reflection and broader political reflection, One, I think it does demonstrate a distance between what people are feeling in their everyday lives and what they thought the Parliament was focused on instead. And second, I think there was, as I say, a bit of organisational capture, which I think we're seeing in some institutions play out. But third is, how do we recognise that trans people don't feel any more protected since the GRR bill process? Women feel no more reassured. They feel a lot more reassured post the Supreme Court ruling, but they didn't feel any more reassured since the passing of the GRR bill. And ultimately, I think all communities have fundamentally been failed by this entire process. And look, we don't set the government agenda, but as I say, we should have been much, much more robust in the conditionality of our support in the GRR bill process based upon our amendments that we argued for in that bill and have argued for since.
Time's moving on. I've got such a lot I want to talk to you about, but I do want to talk to you about your reasonably recently expressed commitment to what we might call the free stuff. So you've come out in favour of keeping bus passes, prescriptions, eye tests, and as you'd expect me to raise, free university tuition. And you describe these, including free university tuition, as devolution's greatest successes. On tuition fees, you can't possibly be serious when you say you regard free university tuition as one of devolution's greatest success. I don't even believe you think that, I've got to say. You look at Dundee, there are a number of reasons for Dundee being in the position it's in. Edinburgh, making pretty savage cuts. Plenty of other institutions are in trouble of one form or another. Every single university principal I speak to is warning that a rethink of the funding structure, the rethinking the tuition fees position, worse is to come. The cap on student numbers means Scottish kids, some of them, aren't able to go to the institution they want, have to go down south and pay fees there that they might prefer to pay in Scotland in some form of repayment scheme. Our universities have become reliant on fee-paying students from overseas, and the drop in their number over the past year or so has created all sorts of problems. And yet, you've come out and said that free tuition is one of the great successes of devolution. I don't know how many people in the room would agree with that. I wonder whether the public really thinks that, and I wonder whether your decision to support it is a matter of swerving a difficult political position rather than something you believe as a core principle.
Well, what I said was there are successes of devolution and gains of devolution. I actually think when you talk about great successes or great achievements, actually it's outcomes for people, and I think the outcomes, there is an outcomes gap, and I think we in Scotland often focus on the inputs. But the broader point I make is, I do support free bus travel, but we need to give people buses to go on. The number of buses that have gone down by hundreds at the same time as we've got all these free bus passes, because we're focusing on a headline policy rather than lived outcome for individuals. I do support free prescriptions, but the reality is it's all very well good having free prescriptions, but you have to wait 2 years to get a hip replacement and pay 18 grand to get a hip replacement by getting a mortgage in your home or borrowing from your friends and your family. There's an inherent contradiction in terms of that policy and principle. And on free tuition, I do support free tuition. I might surprise you with that, Chris, but I do support free tuition, but the status quo is fundamentally broken. And we've got to accept the status quo is fundamentally broken. I think you are right to say that there is a challenge where I think right now what's happening is there is a bit of probably swapping of middle-class kids. So middle-class kids from Scotland going to study in England, and middle-class kids in England coming to study in Scotland. That then gives you broader skills challenges in terms of kids not coming back, or the kids that do come here go back to other parts of the UK or indeed other parts of the world. And all of that, I think, has to be looked at in the round as we define a new funding model for tertiary education. And the reason why I mentioned tertiary education, not just universities, because college budgets have been absolutely decimated as well. And if we're being honest about it, the route more often for working class kids to get either to university or to meaningful employment is actually college, rather than directly to university. And I think we have got a cultural barrier in Scotland where I think the broader population is at risk of looking like it believes going to university is the premiership, going to college is the championship, getting an apprenticeship is the first division, and going straight into work means you're in the Conference League. And I think that fundamentally is an insult to the young people of this country who will have different routes and different pathways of success. Some of the most successful people in our country, and indeed the world, never went to university. And so, yes, university should be valued, but it's not the only route. But to answer the funding point, I've written to every principal of every university in the country. I've written to University of Scotland, every principal of our colleges, to say, how do we build an alternative to the status quo whilst protecting free tuition. Because despite what anyone might think in terms of good intentions or not on free tuition is overwhelmingly supported by the Scottish population. And if that is the accepted will of the Scottish population, how do we maintain that settled will of the Scottish population around free tuition whilst recognising that there has got to be a different funding model for further higher education?
The settled will of the Scottish population, and explain to them that in the modern economic climate and the changes that are happening around the world to our ageing population, to our health budget, that some of the strains are going to come in that will require us to shift money from one thing to another and to ask people to pay for things they didn't previously have to pay for, and that something like getting the benefit of university education, and there are different models to look at in terms of repayment, is a reasonable thing to ask, given all of the other strains that are going to be on the public purse, like the Fiscal Commission, the Audit Scotland.
I'll tell you why,
Keep
Chris.
telling us.
I'll tell you why, Chris, because you heard it in the introduction before we came on the stage. People are saving less and less. People have less disposable income than they had before. And I think there is a fundamental misjudgment in Scotland about who has the broadest shoulders. And that's part of the income tax debate. I don't think someone that earns 28 grand or 32 grand has the broadest shoulders, therefore can pay higher taxes in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK and feel as if they get less and less in return. And what do we class as being someone that has got the broadest shoulders and therefore looks at a tuition fee model when young people aren't saving in a way they did before? More and more young people are living for the moment rather than thinking about longer term future around pension funds or pension pots or what happens in their retirement. The cost of living crisis is real. The amount of disposable income people have is much, much lower than it was in previous generations. Entering the housing market and getting on the housing ladder is harder and harder than it was for generations before us. All of these things pose financial challenges on individual, young people and families in the here and now, and is only going to get more challenging in the future. I don't think adding a layer of tuition fees on that makes it better for us. And I'll give you an example of this. Take our income tax rates in Scotland. If we are going to attract someone that's going to come to be a senior consultant in our NHS and therefore could be earning anywhere between £100,000 and £120,000, if they went to university in England and paid tuition fees and then applies for a senior consultant post in Scotland, some of them are going to have marginal tax rates of 79%. And is that person going to come and work in Scotland's NHS with a marginal tax rate of 79%, or are they going to go and work in Manchester or Birmingham with a marginal tax rate is going to be 59%? And if we're saying we're going to introducing marginal tax rates for everybody across the country above a certain income to 79% or even above 80%, then we are going to have skills going elsewhere, and that is going to be negative for our public services, for example, our NHS, but it's also going to be much, much more difficult to attract talent into some of the amazing businesses and institutions we have represented in this room today.
Okay. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. I've just got one very quick question for you, which is in the oil and gas industry. You've got an election next year. Keir Starmer doesn't. Kent does, but it's your problem, really. And Labour's position on oil and gas has put it into conflict with the industry. Do you think the Rosebank and Jackdaw field should be approved?
In short, I do, because I believe that we made a commitment going into the election that we would honour all existing oil and gas licences, and they were granted oil and gas licences. But I think there's a broader point here, which actually encapsulates some of the global politics that we currently face. I think it's totally right that there is a focus on national security from the UK Labour government and a focus on national security from the Prime Minister Keir Starmer. And actually, for all, even as harsh as critics would say, when it's come to matters of national security, he has looked like he's at his best and is most confident both on the national stage but also on the international stage. And therefore, I support the increase in defence spending, for example. I think that's good for Scotland's economy, given that we have a significant footprint, for example, in our shipbuilding industry, and so that additional spending could yield greater investment, greater growth, and greater job numbers for us here in Scotland. But national security, defence is only one part of it. Energy security is also now at national security. And if we recognise we've got to make different decisions now in our defence infrastructure to meet the challenges of our time, I think we have to think differently about energy policy and energy security too, particularly when we've got despotic regimes like Russia who want to put their boots in our throats. And so I think we have to look at the investment allowances to allow some of the existing oil and gas fields that are fully licensed to make them more investable propositions, rather than just looking at new oil and gas licenses. And actually, I think if we look at those allowances, you could, I believe we would actually yield higher tax receipts than what we are getting now, rather than lower tax receipts, which also then allows us a managed transition. Because I think the conflict here is, often when we talk about oil and gas, people think it's an us versus them. On one side it's renewables, on the other side it's oil and gas. They are symbiotic, because you're only going to get the large-scale investment in the clean energy of the future if those that are currently investing in and invested in oil and gas decide to shift some of those investments to the renewable sector. That's where the large-scale money is going to come from. Government can only play one small part, GB Energy being one example of that, but the large-scale mass investment that needs to come will come largely from those that are currently already operating in the oil and gas sector. And we've also got to recognise that we are now in a global competition for investment, made even more stark by what's happening in the US, where much more isolationism, much more protectionism, and more people pitching for the same investment pots means we have got to make the UK more an attractive investable proposition for people, for those in country, but also for investable propositions for those that have the ability to do foreign direct investment into the country. And so if national security is now part of the key debate, we have to make energy security part of national security.
Well, we don't have lots of time, so I want to take a good bunch of questions. Now, I don't have my glasses on, so if I say the woman in red and you're actually the Cardinal Archbishop of St Andrews, forgive me. But if you do have a question, could you put your hand up now, please? Yes?
Thank you. Maybe one of the two people in the room that think will be First Minister next year.
There's more than two, Kat.
Your agenda is obviously about reform in a small r, and when you're First Minister, it will likely, though, be with a small minority, possibly a coalition, with an SNP who will inevitably come back with an argument that devolution needs to end because we need independence. Perhaps a right-wing cohort in the Parliament that is devolution needs to end and everything goes back to Westminster. How do you both reform Scotland so it delivers better for people on the ground, but also defend devolution so that it lasts another 25 years?
Great question, Kat. And the way we're thinking about it in terms of our policy development and also the outcomes we want to deliver for people across the country is recognising that what are our legislative routes, but also what are the non-legislative routes as well. Because in an ideal world, we'll have a parliament that is willing to debate and approve legislation based on the merits of the legislation, and people willing, or at least a majority in the parliament, are willing to act in good faith. And so we've got to prepare for that scenario. But I think we also have to prepare for a scenario where we have a parliament of minorities, where a majority may prefer the politics of disruption rather than the politics of progress. And therefore it can't be a lost 5 years for Scotland. And so we are looking at every option around what are the legislative routes and what are the non-legislative routes around getting better outcomes for people in different parts, whether it be the National Health Service or education system, skill system, or indeed in terms of attracting investment and growing Scotland's economy. I actually think that there are more grounds for optimism than people think there are. And the reason why I think that is politics is changing so quickly, so often. And I think if we did get a change of government next year, which had a change of emphasis, a change of tone, and carried itself differently, I think that puts a level of political pressure on other political parties too, in terms of how they behave, how they operate, and how they then be part of trying to get progress in Scotland. And one of the reasons why I think that's important is take the independence debate as an example. One of the things that I've very deliberately done over the last 4 years since taking on this job is I've been really clear about my own position on independence. I don't support independence. I don't support another referendum. But I'm not going to turn my back on anybody in terms of the voters. That's my view in terms of those that supported yes, as well as those that supported no. exact same, those that supported Remain or those that supported Leave. I'm not going to turn my back on those people. And I think if we can make an argument to the public that regardless of what you think the final destination for Scotland should be in terms of its constitutional future, we can all agree that it's not working right now and it's our collective interest to make it better. Because ultimately, and this is the point I make to everyone in the room, of course I'm going to try and persuade you to vote Labour come the next election and till the end of time. But the reality is, regardless of your politics past and present, we all have an equal stake in getting this right. We've all got an equal stake in making sure Scotland functions, works and delivers for you, your family, your business, your organisation, the people that you care about and the people that you and your institutions serve. And I think if we can all remember a bit of that, then I actually have much more hope for what we can do in Scotland rather than the current global pessimism I think people feel, as well as some national pessimism.
Another question from this side of the room? Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Anna. It's Anna from Charlotte Street. On university tuition, I just wanted to ask a follow-up. So free university tuition, as we call it, was originally a Labour policy, which most people think is an SNP policy, but it was actually a Labour government that brought that in, but with probably the foresight to recognise that the graduate endowment fee was a way to diversify and, you know, have different levels of income coming into that. So it was actually the SNP who just took away the graduate endowment and has kind of claimed that win for a long time. So given that was originally Scottish Labour's stance, are you open to return of a graduate endowment fee, or just thinking more creatively or openly about what a fair university education system looks like that is funded and sustainable?
Thank you, Anna. That's a better question than Malcolm Robertson could ever have asked. So you should be promoted in Charlotte Street Partners, is what I would say. Any clients that work with Malcolm, you should ask for Anna instead. Or have you? Oh my goodness! Oh, you get the last word, Malcolm? Do you? Malcolm's a great guy. I prefer his dad. He says that about me as well. To be fair, look. So I don't think it's a graduate endowment model. I think we need to think differently about our academic institutions, both our colleges and our universities. And right now, I think there's some positive language that we use around their role in economic development, regional development, and growth, without them actually being at the heart of it and being part of the decision-making, the conversation and the positive outcomes. And I think if we can get a level of regionalisation in Scotland similar to what's happened in other parts of the UK, so think about Greater Manchester, think about London as a city, they are very innovatively getting academia, universities, colleges round the table as part of the growth conversation, economic conversation, not just the skills outcomes conversation. And I think if we did the same here, there are opportunities for us in terms of some of the investable propositions that universities are already engaged in, some of the startups and the unicorns that universities are already engaged in, and them getting more of a meaningful return from that. But also much greater integration and partnership with companies and sectors as well. And I don't think we've explored that side of the relationship anywhere near as much as we could have and should have. So I think we have to rethink how we do the apprenticeship levy as an example of that, which right now, to be honest, on big business feels like a tax rather than helping them support their skills supply chain. How do we reform the apprenticeship levy? How do we think about lifelong learning, where how people think about work and the world of work has fundamentally shifted, and how universities and colleges and apprenticeships fit into that. So again, a stat that always stays with me is, so my parents' generation worked on average 2 or 3 jobs in their life. And this generation is predicted to work 5 or 6 jobs in their life. The next generation, my kids' generation, your kids' generation, is predicted to work 12 or 13 jobs in their life. That is a huge challenge for an employer and a huge challenge for an education and skills system, because an employer will invest time, money, resource, energy into an employee, maybe get them to where they want them to get to, and then that employee is away to go to another institution. And I don't think our skills system is caught up with that new reality. And that's the kind of fundamental reshaping and rethinking of learning and of education and lifelong learning that I think we need to do if we're thinking about the future. And that's the conversation I want to have with college and university principals as we think about a new funding model that makes them part of the growth and the economic conversation, not just the social outcome conversation.
Two more questions we'll take two at once. Yes, there. Sarah, you've been with them today, so I'm not going to get you a question if that's all right. And yes, the woman at the back.
Hi, Anas. Jo Buckley from the Denard Centre.
Good to see you in Scotland, Jo, rather than New York.
Good to see you here. We haven't touched on creative industries and the cultural sector at all this evening, which is interesting, I think, because I think they're not only vital to Scotland's identity, but also to our economy. And the Chancellor has spoken in placing economic growth as her top priority about the vital role that the creative industries play in that. So I'm quite interested to know what Scottish Labour would be doing to empower the same kind of growth across the creative industries and cultural sector in Scotland when you're First Minister.
And we'll just take the final question from the lady at the back in the yellow.
Thank you for what you've said so far. You referred to the lack of savings or the will to save amongst probably now two generations. In order to create, inculcate, develop those degrees of resilience and responsibility, what 3 steps on what timescale would you propose?
Great question. I'll come to that one last, right? But really, really good question. Jo, you touched upon something that's an obsession with mine. And part of what I thought a lot about when we were in the US for Tartan Week, some of it really positive, some of it that I think is work needed, to put it mildly, is I think the way we think about our arts and culture sector is we think about it as a nice add-on to have rather than the key driver of economic growth and using our identity to leverage investment and positive outcomes. And therefore, I think having culture sitting in the external affairs brief kind of minimises its role rather than using it as a key driver of the economy. And one of the things that we are going to have to do is reshape the Scottish Government to create an economics directorate that sits at the heart of the First Minister's office, to emphasise that it's not just a social policy parliament, which I think is what it's been for the last 25 years, but actually it's an economic policy parliament that delivers good social outcomes for people across our country. So everything is not just social impact assessment looked at, but economic impact assessment looked at. And in those growth areas, we have got to identify what are the low-hanging fruit or the greatest opportunities for Scotland. And I don't think that should be a list of 1,000 things, because I've got a really firm belief that any politician that tells you they've got 100 priorities means they've got none. So I'm really clear about what I think are the 4 key growth areas for Scotland. That's not to say I don't care about other areas, but the 4, I think, most fundamental growth areas for Scotland are maximising the opportunities of the clean energy revolution, which is around proper transition, support for oil and gas sector, and proper transition to the clean energy of the future. Secondly is around Brand Scotland and tourism. How do we tap into the soft power of Scotland in a way that Ireland does masterfully, but Scotland doesn't do anywhere near as effectively, in order to attract maximum investment into the country, exports out of the country, more tourists coming to the country, more people falling in love with different parts of the country, and therefore helping to shape Scotland's story and to demonstrate that Scotland's got a massive neon sign that we're open for business. And I think if I've got one major criticism of Tartan Week in New York, is we have got to break out of the image that Scotland's got great people, which it does. Scotland's got great produce, which it does. Scotland's got a great history and culture, which it does. But actually, is it a good place to do business? Would I put my money there? And we have got to use those first 3 bits, our culture, our history, our produce, and our beautiful landscapes, for maximum economic effect. And I don't think we do that anywhere near enough right now. So that's why I think Brand Scotland tourism has got to be part of that growth sector. Third is digital innovation and technology. That is the way we're going to reform our public services, but also is the way of thinking about the economy of the future and the businesses of the future as well. And the fourth is what I think is the great bridge between economic policy and social policy, which is housing. Is how do we get large-scale housing development in our country that meets the economic challenges we face, but also delivers more positive social outcomes for people across our country. That, for me, are the 4 key growth areas that I want us to drive every institution, every part of government to be delivering in terms of maximising the growth opportunity. In terms of the question you asked, it was, repeat it for me again.
Ways to incentivise saving amongst young people.
So first,
the development in the youngest cohort of leaving secondary education and those up to age 30 about resilience and responsibility
Totally.
and saving and looking
So
for their own future.
so the first thing is,
And what 3 things, on what timescale,
Yep.
would you propose?
so in terms of 3 things, let me tell you the first thing straight away, which is how we think about school needs to fundamentally change. And I know this is a broader obsession, understandably, of Reform Scotland and yourself, Chris, and we might not get a proper full chat around education, but we should at some point, is school is not teaching many of the basic life skills that somebody needs. So people don't think about interest rates, mortgages, loans, inflation, all the rest of it. It's all, for many people, these are abstract concepts that confronts them at a time when they're going to get a mortgage or they're going to get a loan, or when things hit the fan and they're having to think about these things. Why aren't we teaching these things in school? Why don't we have our magnificent financial services actually spending, like actually it used to happen when I was at school, but doesn't happen anywhere near enough now, actually in school, teaching kids about how to set up a bank account, how to save, why it's important to save, what inflation means, what interest means, what a mortgage means, how they save, the positive outcomes that come from saving, how they think about longer term decision making. So that's the first thing, what we do in our schools, and I think we've got to do that straight away. So that's an immediate time scale, and that's going to require, in terms of a skills base, and a really open and positive dialogue with our financial services industry to say, how do you help us deliver this in our schools in a meaningful way from an informed perspective? The second thing then is, how do you give people a hope that home ownership can be a reality for them, so that gives them an incentive for something to save for? Because right now, many people don't save, partly because of the cost of living crisis, but also partly there's no incentive to save for something because they think actually home ownership's never going to be for me. I'm never going to be able to afford a home in that area, or afford a mortgage, or have the level of income that's going to mean I'm able to take out a mortgage, and what that then means in terms of the split of payments over a course of period of time. Is how do you make the dream of home ownership a reality for people again, and therefore give them something to aspire to save for? And that's going to require a rapid house building programme, and I think that can happen over the course of a parliament in a really significant way. Also means reforming our planning system really significantly, because our planning system in Scotland is fundamentally broken, where investment is pushed elsewhere in the country because people are waiting far too long to get some of the most basic decisions in Scotland. And again, that for me, that is a one parliament approach. So the first one immediate, second one a one parliament approach in terms of reforming our planning system and incentivising home building and the dream of home ownership. And then the third is, I mean, this might sound wishy-washy, but what's the purpose of work? Like why are people working? Why are people striving for an income? And what is it they're trying to get out of the outcome the other side? And I think for the vast majority of the population, they feel as if they live to work rather than work to live. And that is posing, I think, to right at the start point we talked about disenfranchisement, people feeling distant from politics, feeling distant from government decisions, is they feel as if they're treated as one of the hamsters on the wheel that's just running, and somebody else is making decisions for them, and they're just struggling to survive the day, the week, the month. And I think if we can give people a sense of hope and direction for where the country is going, and what their role as individuals is in terms of the success for them, their community, the broader economy, and our society, then I think that in itself, I think, helps us to reshape a different story for Scotland's future and Scotland's place in the world. Now, that's not got a timeline. I think that's a much, much more longer term project about belonging, identity, world of work, industries of the future, broader economics, as well as broader reform. So that's an immediate course of a parliament and probably a generational intention as the three.
Well done coming up with three. I can see your brain burning. This might be a bit wishy-washy.
DRN, that's the Chris Deeran's rebrand of Reform Scotland. They move the vowels like Aberdeen.
Listen, thank you. We're out of time, sadly, because there's so much more. Maybe we'll do it again.
Thank you, that was great. Thank you so much.
Nice. And we're going to ask Malcolm to wrap things up.
Malcolm, you're brilliant, by the way. You're brilliant.
I will not keep you. I'll not keep you long. I've got a few thank yous that I want to make, and I'm going to get Anas back for what he said to me about to Anna. I just want to. There's one data point you talked earlier on about opinion polls. Those of you who know me well will know that I bang on about YouGov's mood tracker, and I've mentioned this to you, Anas. I was out speaking to some bankers earlier on today, and I was talking about this mood tracker, which basically takes a weekly snapshot of the country and what kind of a mood are we in. Are we happy? Are we sad? Are we bored? Are we lonely? Are we frustrated? The inspired category in this thing, and you can go and have a look at this tracker. 12% of us feel inspired, which says to me, I think. First of all, it's the most depressing statistic on that tracker, but it says to me, I think, that there's a gap in the market for leadership that inspires people and that excites people and gives people hope. But that will require bravery, it will require a lot of courage, and it will require politicians who are willing to take risks. So I would just encourage all politicians, as best they can in the environment, to have that mindset. Anyway, thank yous. I need to do the thank yous. To the team here at Phoenix, thank you very much for giving us this brilliant room with an amazing vista. The last time we were here it was dark. We've all had the opportunity this time to stare out the window as Chris and Anas were speaking. So thank you very much to
thank you. I think
to Gail, to Judy, Tim, and the rest of the team at Phoenix. Thank you very much for having us. To the team, the behind the scenes team at Reform, and to my team at Charlotte Street Partners. There's an awful lot of work goes into creating these events, and I am very grateful to all of you for doing that. To Chris. Chris and I have worked together for a long time. He's absolutely brilliant at facilitating these conversations and for stewarding really, really interesting discussions, and for just coming up with the idea of the meet the leader. And again, another brilliant conversation tonight. And then Chris, we couldn't get Jackie Bailey, but. But Anas was pretty good. So I would like to, more seriously to thank you, Anas, for engaging so honestly with Chris and with members of the audience. It really is very much appreciated. So thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you all yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. That was good.